And we are back. Welcome back to everybody who's watching live and in the replay crew. If you're in the replay crew, please remember to leave a comment, leave a like, share this out. Let's get word out there, because as everybody can see, I'm joined once again by my friend Mr. Chris Shelton. But this evening we are not going to be talking solely about Scientology, because with the degree that Chris did, one of the areas that he knows a bit about, it's behind the camera, Chris.
Yeah, off the camera.
One of the areas that he covered in that was coercive control in cults, because if, like me, you may know a bit about coercive control within a relationship environment, but it also applies in day-to-day life, and especially in the cult sector. So I felt it was a good idea for us to have this conversation, because it will come up later on in other discussions and videos that will be coming out. So welcome back to the channel, Chris.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We're happy to have you. Coercive control within a cult community.
Yes.
I mean, when you think about it, it is pretty obvious, but it's not the first thing that people would think about. So, can you kind of give a basic outline of how it works within that sort of cult community? Because in a relationship situation, it's very easy to coerce one person, but we're talking hundreds, thousands, sometimes millions of people.
Well, we are, and there are two factors at play that probably help explain or bring it down to the brass tacks of what is coercive control, and why do we call it that? Why have that phrase? Why not just call it abuse, or predatory abuse, or something like that, or domestic abuse, when it's in a domestic situation? And the reason that this phrase exists, and it was invented by a guy named Evan Stark for, in the domestic abuse space, but it very much applies to cults, because it has to do with predatory behavior. And the two things are a repeating pattern of behavior. It's not just a one-off incident of abuse. It's a repeating pattern of abuse. And two, the codependency factor. The fact that the people involved are what you could say overly emotionally invested in the relationship or the nature of the relationship. And that's on both sides. Predator, prey, cult leader, followers, they need each other for this sort of twisted relationship to exist. And I don't say that from some kind of blame the victim approach, but it's a fact. It's a codependency is what it is. And so that has to be part of the understanding of kind of what's going on in a cult situation.
Yeah. And obviously, with going back to your experience in Scientology with this, we also see that escalating as we do sometimes in a domestic situation, with David Miscavige starting to beat people up and use violence to keep people under control. But I guess to be able to do that, you've first got to get the mind twisted by controlling the mind.
Well, yeah, you have to get somebody to buy into some reason to put up with the abuse, basically, and the predation. And to be clear, coercive control does not have to be or involve physical violence in order for it to be coercive control. Patterns of abuse can involve financial abuse, emotional or psychological abuse, a campaign of lies and deception designed to introvert and get a person even questioning their very identity and sense of self. And you can drive somebody, like that old movie Gaslight, you can drive somebody to the point of madness without ever touching them. So a key part of understanding this also, of course, is that it doesn't always involve physical violence, but if we're being honest, it usually enters the picture at some point.
Yeah, I know, because in some of the documentaries and stuff that I was watching just to get a basic understanding before we had this conversation, I know a lot of people were saying that they didn't realize the coercive control was going on with the member of the family until the violence started. Or
right. It's a very obvious sign that something's gone horribly wrong in this relationship, right? Whether domestic or group or school or your job, even, once things become physically violent, you've crossed some kind of line. But usually those lines were crossed far earlier, because it's all about violating boundaries. That's one of the key ways that control is exerted, is people are not allowed to have boundaries, or those boundaries are ridiculed or made fun of, but somehow or another they are torn down, redefined. They can be made to feel that a person can be made to feel that their boundaries are unnecessary, that they are somehow an impediment to full trust between us, this kind of thing. And this is exactly the kind of thing that is why the mechanisms of control that we talk about exist, like confession, for example, as the transparency or openness that is demanded by a predator can be pretty extreme. It can be like, you have no right to any boundaries at all. I'm your cult leader and you must tell me everything, for example. So that's a component of this.
Yeah. So when it is happening in a group, when you're talking about a cult situation, does it just manifest itself with the cult leader's behavior, or can it manifest itself with the behavior of the people next rung down, or even next rung down from that? So in a Scientology context, for example, not necessarily David Miscavige standing on the stage at the international event or whatever, but going down as far as auditors, for example.
Oh, absolutely. And okay, so yeah, absolutely. Cults are hierarchical structures, right? They have a leadership and a usually an inner group and an entourage or something around that cult leader. But then there's some kind of hierarchy, and there's different ways of explaining it or describing it, I guess. And one of the ways might be that the methods of control that the cult leader and the dogma that he puts together, whatever they demand, or whatever it is that's sort of emanating from that source point, so to speak, cascades. It rolls out to the rest of the membership. They look to the leader for their model of how to behave. And if the cult leader is doing abusive stuff and saying this is how it is and this is how it's supposed to be, then they will mirror that behavior and take it on as, their own identity. And that's how you get all the confusion with identity in cult members, as they're trying to be this abusive, predatory person, right? Or trying to emulate that person. So, and this is not gender specific at all. It's males, females. It applies equally across the boards to this. There's no gene that makes this happen. This is purely behavioral conditioning,
Absolutely. So I know I'm going to sound like I'm defending David Miscavige for a minute, but now he's running Scientology. Would you, in your opinion, I know he's coercively controlling those that are in Scientology now, but would, in your opinion, he have been coercively controlled by the teachings of L. Ron Hubbard when L. Ron Hubbard was alive, and then it's sort of manifested itself within him, or do you think it was already there before that?
Well, we know that David Miscavige grew up in an abusive household under a former Marine father who was not shy about using his fists to enforce his will. So that's there. And that's there from the beginning of his life forward. So those formative years were, maybe not the best for him. Now, I'm not saying that Ron Miscavige Sr. didn't love his sons or his kids or, provide for them and all that kind of stuff. I mean, we all knew Ron, and he was a decent guy, but he was, and self-admittedly, physically abusive, and that takes a toll on kids. So he wasn't really set up for success as best we could say as he could have been. Then Ron Miscavige Sr., David's dad, discovers Scientology and brings that into the family and brings that into the mix. And David Miscavige, had asthma and was apparently not a big kid. He's a short man, and he was a little pugilistic, they say, right? A little fighty, So that set him up pretty well to fit right in with the Scientology culture of the 1970s, especially when he said, okay, I want to go all in on this. And I think he was 16 years old when he joined the Sea Org. And
if I remember rightly from everything I've heard, yeah.
Yeah. And so as a minor, he was in there. And the 1970s of Scientology, directly under L. Ron Hubbard, because apparently he got there pretty quickly within a year or two of his arrival in the Sea Org. He was working with Hubbard or working as a messenger in that area. So he kind of went straight rocket ride to the top. And of course, he was coercively controlled that entire time he was there. That's what the Sea Org is all about, and the environment around L. Ron Hubbard was brutal. This was at the time when they were out in the desert filming the tech films, 1978, 79, 80 time period, before he went off in his Bluebird and disappeared into the Pacific Northwest for many years, right? So it was a rough place for a kid to be. And Miscavige was a kid. I mean, people don't really talk about him that way at that time, but he was. Mm-hmm. And he learned at the knee of Hubbard. I mean, he was watching very closely, and rose up to a position of power pretty early. So I think he learned the ropes of what it was all about and what he needed to do and how he needed to navigate that environment. And he did so successfully because he had been abused and because he was in a kind of a pushy, abusive, impatient, antagonistic kind of person. That's how I've heard him described at that time. I didn't know him then, so I'm only operating on secondhand information, but that's kind of the picture I've put together of him at that time. So I don't think there's anything about David Miscavige's genes or genetics or anything that makes him what he is. I think it's all right there.
Fair enough. The reason I use David Miscavige as the example is obviously you've got experience of being in the Sea Org and being in Scientology, so he makes sense to be used as the example.
Absolutely. And really you're asking about, sort of something akin to, generational trauma. Does it pass? Can you do this? Yeah, absolutely you can.
From my counseling background, that was part of the thought process of, would it have been something that could have developed in him, or did he already have it because of generational trauma? So that was part of the thought process behind that question.
Yeah, for sure.
So I know you've made some notes, so I'm doing questions off the cuff as I'm going here. So would you say coercive control is there in all cults and high control groups, or is it just some of them that use coercive control? Because I know, because every cult, every high control group is different. I mean, if you ask me, I would say that Christianity uses coercive control, because if you read some of the stuff they tell you got to follow in the Bible, it's like, hang on a minute, whoa.
Fair enough. Yes. Well, here's how I just thought of this, and maybe I'll start using this. This might be a good way of responding. You tell me. A book does not coercively control someone. People do.
Yeah, but the book was written by people.
Well, no, a book is written by people, but to be clear, the point is a book is just something that sits on a table, right? It's what people do with it. And I've often said that it is not the belief set or the system of belief or the rituals of a cult. Well, maybe the rituals, because that's what you do with it, right? It's what you do. I only stress this because I push back a little bit on, the major religions are cults, sort of thing. But
I'm not saying they're a cult. I'm just saying that if you take the Bible and its literal meaning, that the people who wrote it, it can come across as very coercive. That's what I meant. I'm not saying
you could say it has a strict reading of the Bible. Certainly, begs for some stern interpretation of how to discipline people, for example. Sure, that's definitely there. But there's thousands and thousands of people who call themselves Christians who don't do or want to have anything to do with any of that. So it really is a lot to do with the interpretation, what people do with it. And there's an awful lot of human beings in this world who use their religion as a weapon to coercively control people. No question about it, from the bottom to the top. And I think that's a really important point to remember, because I have had to deal for years with people telling me about how institutions are cults and how, they're all coercive and this kind of thing. And there's a little bit more shades of gray to it than that. I'm not suggesting you're doing that. I'm talking about, stuff I've run into in the past, right? But yes,
the only reason I use the only reason I use the Bible as an example is the same as using David Miscavige as an example with you and cult leaders. With you coming out of Scientology, I come out of a Christian background, grew up around the Bible. I was training to be a vicar 20 years ago. So it's my background. That's the only reason I'm using it as the example. I'm not saying they are definitely a cult.
No worries at all. And like I said, I didn't want to put words in your mouth. I was just kind of talking about some of what I've run into over the years. But to really, I should have just said it right from the get-go to answer your question. Yes, coercive control is necessary. It's a component, definitive part of a cult, a destructive cult, or a high control group. High control is really a euphemism for coercive control. It's it's just a softer way of saying it.
Yeah. So, having said that, now that we've established that, I realise coercive control takes many, many forms. Yeah. And I would say in Scientology, a lot of it is to do with the money and controlling that. But I'm sure it can come across in other ways, in other cults as well.
So, very much so. Absolutely. Yes. In fact, I made a list. So
I thought you had. That's why I went down that rabbit hole.
No problem. Yeah. I brought papers. Okay. So in terms of signs of coercive control in cults, right? You can look up, and there are many very good websites out there, domestic hotline, domestic abuse websites that break down coercive control in a domestic situation. And there are models of this and lots of studies. When it comes to coercive control in cultic situations, it's a lot of extrapolating that to group situations, gangs, human trafficking even. These all follow these sort of these sort of characteristics of what coercive control really is, because coercive control is not just domestic abuse, it's human abuse. And so the kind of things you'll see in groups that make them coercive or controlling groups is authoritarian leadership. The power is invested in the leader only. There's no democracy, there's no voting, there's no feedback. They might put on the appearancy or air of soliciting feedback or opinions from the membership, but they don't care. The only feedback they're looking for from the membership is what do I need to do to control you better? And so when you see surveys or questionnaires or things like that, distributed within a cult, it's usually along those lines. The power rests with the leader. This is crucial to having a cult situation. If power is equally distributed amongst all the members, or it's a commune kind of thing, then it's really not a cult at all. It has to be centralized. Usually, by the way, people agree to that because the leader is charismatic. And charisma is not just good looking. L. Ron Hubbard was certainly not good looking, according to a great many people, but he was charismatic. When he was in the room, you knew he was in the room. He was unignorable. He was larger than life. He was usually in a social situation quite gregarious. He was very, he could tell jokes. He could be the life of the party. He could be incredibly social. So that's what I mean by charismatic, is somebody who gets your attention and keeps it. Because they are fascinating, interesting, sometimes good looking, those kinds of things. And they will, therefore, there are inborn, I'll just comment on this real fast. It's not really a cult thing, but it's just kind of funny that there are these kind of inherent biases that we have about attractive people. We believe they tell the truth more often. We believe they are deserve leadership or deserve higher pay and this kind of thing, just because they're good looking. It's really quite something. So charisma does have something to do with looks, but it's more than that. And the other thing, of course, about that is that with the authoritarian part of leadership is that it's not to be questioned. A cult leader is not there to sit and answer all your questions and reason you into their point of view. Sometimes, and in certain circumstances, they will do that and they will put on that show. But the reality of a destructive cult is that the leadership, whether it's one person or a group, they are the steel fist in the velvet glove, right? And they are not going to be disagreed with. They might use very flowery language to get you where they want you to go, but they're not going to be disagreed with. And they're also not going to be made wrong. If something goes wrong, it's not their fault, right? It's not the leader's fault ever. There's always a scapegoat. So that's a key part of it, is that authoritarian leadership. Another part of this, there are three basic elements to coercive control, no matter what the situation is, right? Which is isolation, manipulation, and control. So the isolation factor is also very, very important. And this is what cults are all about, is getting into that whole us versus them, and we're special and they're not, and that whole attitude that is started really on day one with, we have a secret, we have a mystery, we have knowledge for you, we have something for you, we have something you can get, something you can do, some service, some thing, some mystery. We're going to draw you in with this. And that is compelling to people. Very compelling. Again, these are playing on our most basic, ways of manipulating people. So members in a cult are isolated eventually, maybe not necessarily on day one, but pretty quick. The us versus them starts up. You should be down here at the center more often. You should come to the rituals every weekend, not just once a month. This kind of, they're slowly working you in there so that it's taking more and more of your time, more and more of your energy, and of course, more and more of your money. But also at the same time, discouraging you from outside endeavors or activities. In Scientology, they even go so far as to call it other practices. You can't do yoga. You can't do your Reiki. You got to just do the Scientology, right? But this could even mean you can't go to the doctor at all. They'll start calling that an other practice. Or you can't go down to the synagogue anymore. Maybe you're, from a Jewish faith, or you can't have friends who are, down at the mosque anymore, or, right? These controls slowly start coming into your life. and they insinuate themselves, usually speaking, they insinuate themselves in such a way that a person is, it's the frog in the boiling water thing, right? It's so slow and gradual that, by the time you realize what's happening, it's kind of too late, So that isolation factor is really important. Of course, stop me if you have any questions.
I will.
So then there are methods.
Going back before you go on to the next bit,
absolutely.
On that one, because I watched Mark and Claire's video that they brought out earlier on. I think it was yesterday, because I only watched it this morning because I was working yesterday, so I only watched it this morning. We know that Scientology say you can be in a different religion and still be a Scientologist.
So they say.
They don't really mean it.
No. Really.
So this whole thing where they do this Christmas celebration, Winter Wonderland stuff every year.
Mm-hmm.
Is this all part, in your opinion, because I know in mine it is, but is it all part of that coercive control of getting people to think, oh, they do support other religions, they are good with blah, blah, blah. So to bring people into that way of thinking.
I mean, in a way, it's deceptive in that they really truly do not believe in Christ or in Christ as a savior figure or any of that. But I'm going to give Christmas a lot of latitude, right? I'm going to give that a pretty wide berth because Christmas has been so secularized in our culture that it doesn't demand any real belief in order to celebrate Christmas. Now, Scientology does not internally or externally say we are celebrating Christ the Savior. What they say is we celebrate the true spirit of Christmas. There's a quote from Hubbard that was always distributed at Christmas time within the church about how we are the holders or the guarantors of the true spirit of Christmas, which is freedom and peace for all mankind, and this kind of Yuletide good greetings and love and all this kind of thing. And Scientologists can hook up with that idea because that's how they think about Scientology and their own faith, if you will. So I don't really see it as a deceptive part of the package, although I know that there are people who position it that way. I really don't see it that way. If they were presenting...
I could put a spanner in everybody's works where Christmas is concerned, because Christmas was taken by the Christians and it's actually the pagan festival of the trees.
Of course. I mean, as though this is, something new the Christians did. I think you'll find if you look at any conqueror, colonial, imperial sort of situation, you'll find, especially of a religious nature, you're going to find our entire history is filled with merging of the cultures and the holidays and the beliefs, right? So, of course, Christmas is no different.
I just want to bring up a comment that's just come up from EC. It's slightly off topic, but it might be something that you may know something about. Hello from Ireland. People from Eastern Europe are joining Scientology Ireland just for a better life and to live in Ireland. Very few, albeit, I believe. Have you heard anything about this?
Yeah, I do. Tony and I talked about this last week in our Straight Up and Vertical show. Apparently, the Church of Scientology.
This is what happens when I forget to watch one of your Straight Up and Vertical.
No worries. So apparently, the Church of Scientology of Ireland, and Ireland has something on the order of, maybe I think Tony quoted it as. Don't quote me on this for sure. I think he said 76. Or maybe a couple hundred or something, 176 Scientologists total in the country, right? By census. Like, it's really, they're so tiny, they might as well not even be there. So apparently, one of their new recruitment tactics is to go to people who are seeking asylum or refugee status in Ireland and telling them that they can come and volunteer and work for the church and get a certificate. They're not going to pay them, but they'll give them some kind of piece of paper that is supposed to ease or grease the lines with their refugee status, which is total. Well, it's just not true. I don't know if I want to swear here, but it's
then if it's to do with refugee status, they'd have to be coming from Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, those sorts of Eastern European
that's right.
nations. Because if it was Poland, Latvia, any of those that are in the EU, there isn't that issue.
Right. So this is a scam, as far as I understand it. The Church of Scientology has no power in Ireland to do anything when it comes to, greasing the lines for refugees or immigrants or people seeking asylum. But they'll tell these people that they will and do to get the free labor out of them, apparently. And I mean, this is not a class of people who are coming in with a lot of money and that kind of thing. So I think Scientology is really using this as a kind of a workhouse sort of setup. And I don't really understand the motivations there other than trying to get their stats up. And it might really be that stupid and simple.
My guess, especially with everything that's happening in America at the moment, it's probably easier for them to get them into Ireland than it is to get them into the States or even into the UK.
Well, these people who are being gotten by Scientology Ireland, I understand, they're not arranging travel for these people to Ireland. They're grabbing them once they're already there.
Ah, right. Okay. That makes more sense.
Now, Scientology has done some shady shit when it comes to Eastern Europe and immigration visas and R1 visas, religious worker visas here in the United States. And there's a whole backstory to that, which is way more involved than this Ireland story. What I understood from the Ireland story was this was a sort of a weird sort of solution to getting flyers handed out or getting the stats up or something by going and using these people as a workforce, which is a little bit of a different operation from trying to get people into the Sea Org and onto, and visas and this whole sort of thing that they were doing. Maybe it's related and I just, we don't have all the information. At least I haven't seen it all, but that's what I know about it right now.
But EC, we will keep you updated if we get any more information about that.
Yep.
Okay. So going back to what we were talking about, I rudely interrupted you at point number 2. You were just going to go on to point number 3.
Yeah. Thought reform. So part of the operation of what a cult leader does is engage in thought reform of his or her membership. And by thought reform, we mean applying methods of influence that are a little heavy-handed. Whether it's, the isolation stuff, whether it's, intense indoctrination sessions. David Koresh would, for example, down in Waco many years ago, would spend 12 to 14 to 16 hours at a stretch straight preaching to his followers out of the Bible. And out of his, ramblings, of course, because he thought he was Jesus and reincarnated, and he had a lot to say. So that is a form of trance induction. You induce trance in people. You get them into a place where they're just not thinking. They're just inflowing information uncritically or unquestioningly, right? Their skepticism is turned off. And this is how you can sort of just feed somebody just tons and tons of information. You can also engage in chanting, mantras, rituals, meditation, auditing. You can do this TRs for just hours and hours and hours and hours, right? And just wear people out with that. This is a form of thought reform. This is a way of getting people to just give in and be compliant. The whole point of thought reform of these techniques of confession and loaded language and milieu control and all these things that Robert Lifton described out of what China was doing to their people back in the day, that all of that is designed to wear people down, break down their boundaries, break down their defenses, make them codependent, and make them compliant. A cult is a compliance culture. It's a place where you're told to jump, and your role is to ask how high, not why. It was not yours to reason why. It was only yours to do or die, right?
Absolutely.
It's that kind of a setup. And all of those methods of, from the brutal interrogations to all the rest, is all about getting that compliant state of mind. It's very 1984-ish that way.
Yeah. And from the research that I'm doing at the moment on other cult groups, including the Queen of Canada video, which is the first re-record that I'm trying to get, that I want to get out, but my old computer crashed when I was halfway through editing it. But they all do it in very different ways. But when you boil it down to the crutch of the problem, it's the same thing. They're coercing people into believing something that might not even exist.
Oh, it hardly ever exists, right? I mean, that's the deceptive part of this. See, the funny thing about a lot of this, just to kind of throw this out there, the funny thing is that were these things true, then morally or ethically speaking, it may well be that it would be the moral choice to dedicate 18 hours of your waking day to, making it happen. If Scientology could really deliver personal spiritual freedom and immortality to every single person on this planet, for real, like they say they do, I mean, people would be banging down. I mean, you shut up and take my money, right? You couldn't happen fast enough.
We'd all be there. You'd still be there. I'd be somewhere doing it.
My ass off, right? Because I'd be part of a justified, rational cause that was actually really changing something. The buffoonery of this, the real ultimate silliness of this, almost at a Monty Python level of goofiness, is that none of these dogmas are true. Not legitimately, rationally, factually speaking. I mean, faith-wise, anything's possible, but that's faith, and that's not what Scientology, for example, claims to be. It says it's a scientific fact. It says Xenu actually existed and actually brought people here 76 million years ago and dropped atomic bombs in volcanoes that didn't even exist at that time. That's the literal truth, according to L. Ron Hubbard. It's not a metaphor or an analogy or something. So it can't be true. There's just no truth to this at all. But it's kind of funny how if it were true, it would be a whole different talk. It would be a whole different discussion. And that's the power of why I stress how deceptive these groups are, how they are built on just a forest of lies, and people unfortunately have a lot of hopes and a lot of dreams and a lot of goals and a lot of emotional needs, and they anchor them to these con men who take them for a ride. And that's kind of what's going on with these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is the same, because digging into these other groups that I've started digging into, you look at the original leaders, and I am going to use Mormonism as an example here, Joseph Smith. And then you look at somebody like an L. Ron Hubbard, a David Miscavige, the more modern day cult leaders. And it's like, yeah, hang on a minute. It flows right through history. I found the golden plates. Where are these golden plates? Oh, they've gone back to heaven, but this is the book that came from these golden plates. And with L. Ron Hubbard, it was Xenu dropped these people into these volcanoes that didn't exist, and then atomic bomb. Where's the proof? Trust me, bro.
Exactly. I recalled it in my auditing. I mean, that's literally the proof for most of Scientology is L. Ron Hubbard remembered it, or Hubbard claimed 2 or 3 people remembered these incidents, and therefore everybody must have experienced them. And he's very specific about things that he should not be specific about. So it's pretty bad,
But we all know with L. Ron Hubbard that he had a vivid imagination. You've only got to look at the amount of Pulp Fiction that he pumped out, that he had a very, very vivid imagination.
He did.
And again, it's something that I've seen with a lot of these cult leaders, that they take a belief system. In L. Ron Hubbard's case, they're going against psychiatry. But in, let's say, the Jonestown, taking biblical belief and then blowing it up.
That's right.
And because you're basing it on something that's true, people are sitting there going, well, hang on, maybe we weren't understanding it right before. And that's what gets them under control.
Well, I'm really glad you just mentioned that, because I mentioned codependency earlier. The cult leaders are the best ones, the ones who really last. And let's face it, there's really only a handful of them that we've heard, that we know their names. There really are not lots and lots of super, super successful cult leaders, not growing cults that are thousands strong. But the ones who do last and are good are the ones who can weave a story or weave a narrative where the membership or the followers are plugging in a lot of the answers themselves. They're kind of contributing to it, not crowdsourcing the dogma. The dogma comes from the cult leader, but there's a lot of fill in the blanks. It's a little Mad Libby. Remember those things, right?
Yeah.
I was just remarking on this morning, because L. Ron Hubbard, for example, would drop many, maybe 20, 30 different breadcrumbs, little tidbits, little bits of here and there. There are implant stations on Mars. That's it. That's all you get. There's implant stations on Mars. What the hell does that? What? I mean, that implies so much more backstory and so much more to it than there's some buildings on Mars where spiritual entities are sucked in and brainwashed. Basically, that's what an implant station is. It's a place that brainwashes you. So Hubbard makes this claim in this lecture in 1962. Yeah, there's these implant stations on Mars. And then he goes on. And you're like, what? And there's about 20 of those kind of quotes. And that's what you get for the history of man, so there's a lot of fill in the blanks going on by the membership, and it's quite interesting. This is just an interesting little thing, but how unique the experience can be for each individual cult member, because they're kind of inventing their own narrative at the same time that the cult leader is giving them the breadcrumbs or the tidbits, if that all makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you with the basis of history of man. I have sat and read that particular work by Mr. L. Ron Hubbard, and I would not recommend it to anybody.
It's
my brain is still hurting from trying to make sense of it.
Oh, it's just nasty. I mean, and to this day, they haven't even corrected the factual inaccuracies around, things like. Anyway, I'm getting into minutia now. I don't want to. Yeah. It's just so wild what they get away with, I guess, is really what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So
because I'm conscious that we are on a time limit, because I don't like these to go on too long, and we're covering the basics. Is there anything else in your notes that I haven't asked about that you want to get out there as we're covering the basics? I mean, we can come back and we can do a part 2 and we can dive in a bit deeper into stuff, but I want to get the basics out there because it is going to come up a lot in future videos.
Absolutely. And let me throw a couple more out here as far as defining characteristics of destructive cults, things that they just don't. Every one of them does this. Okay, here's a couple others just real fast. The us versus them mentality of a cult culture is intense. It's not on day one, of course, right? Again, this is all gradually being spoon-fed to the members until they, accept it themselves and believe it to be true, because they're bonding socially with this group is what's happening, right? And their reality is slowly changing to the reality that is being spun by the group. And it's all about social proof and influences and stuff like that. There's a guy, Caldini, who wrote a book about influence, which is really good in explaining this stuff. But one of the key things that is always part of a cult is what happens when you try to leave. What's the experience? And the experience is uniformly they try everything they can to stop you from leaving, discourage you, threaten you. And if you do leave, you are shunned, you are disconnected, you are disfellowshipped, you're booted unceremoniously and with a lot of anger, sometimes hate, and you are considered an apostate, a former believer. But that word has all this baggage with it of, you turned on us, you are disloyal, and therefore you're kind of an outcast from this group now. You're not welcome back. Or they might even start stalking you to make sure you keep your damn mouth shut and you be a good little ex-member and just go about your life and not do or say anything about this former group you were part of. There's a paranoia almost built into most cults. Not most, to all of them, really. That's one of the reasons they do this. So that whole exit part of the picture is also part of the cult package. They never let you just walk out the door. If they did, it wouldn't be a cult.
Absolutely. And that is one of my arguments when people say to me, Christianity is a cult. I say, no, it's not, because I was allowed to just walk out the door. My family haven't shunned me. They're all Christians. They haven't shunned me. So that takes a lot of the cult part out of it.
That's right. And one other thing I want to throw in real fast, because it's also kind of an important element of almost every single one of these groups. Well, every one of them. I'm always so used to conditionalizing myself on stuff, but these are things that aren't conditional. These are always true. There is some form of work or attention grabbing or somehow perpetually happening crisis or work or necessity that keeps the emotions and the anxiety levels high. There's an enemy who must be fought. There's a battle that must be won. There is some emergency situation that always has to be dealt with. Things are never just rolling along at a good grinding pace. It's never like that in a cult. It might be for short periods, mind you. There might be a period where, for a week or two or three, maybe the cult leader's on vacation or something. Everybody kind of chills and everybody's just kind of getting along and doing the work. But then, some kind of thing happens and it's all hands on deck, 24/7, nobody's sleeping. And this is frequent. It manifests again in different ways, but it's always a unifying, controlling factor of these groups that the cult leader is constantly demanding more than the group can produce. And that's what keeps them kind of riveted to him in a state of perpetual guilt about not doing enough for the cult leader. And again, I say him, could be her. And constantly questioning their own status and value to the group because of these demands. It's a whole trick that the cult leaders do to keep everybody as much as they possibly can. They'll tell you words and use language that is, again, very flowery, very, we're all kumbaya and one for all and all for one and all that. But at the end of the day, it's not that way. It's the exact opposite of that. and the cult leader is always exempt from every rule and always gets away with violating every agenda point or commandment or whatever, and the followers are always held to the ultimate standard and can never match up to that standard. They can never meet it. That's by design. Keep everybody on their toes all the time. That's how you keep people under control.
Absolutely. So just now that we've covered the basics, like I said, we can always do a part 2 or a part 3 and go a bit deeper into these points. I just wanted to get the basics out there tonight so that people have an understanding of when coercive control comes up, and I start bringing it up in some of these future videos. It makes sense that why we're calling it coercive control, because as I said, a lot of people in day-to-day will have heard it as part of an interpersonal relationship, but won't have associated it with the larger group. So if we can getting the basics out there. But I just want to move on to an interesting question that Polar Vortex put up while we were talking. I don't want to go into politics, but what about power imbalances between leaders of countries? Does coercive control play a part in it? For example, trade negotiations?
I will say that power definitely plays a control in international relations or foreign relations or trade. Absolutely, it does. America, for example, wields its, rattles its saber at will all over the world in order to get what it wants. And that's a fact of life. Power imbalances are what they are, and countries use them. Let's stress, though, that countries are sovereign nations. They're groups of people represented by a leadership, and that leadership exists to forward the goals and culture of their own country. And while that sounds super obvious, we sometimes will lay a lot of moral outrage and judgment on other countries or cultures because they don't act the way we think they should act from our point of view. And that's a mistake, right? So one thing that's really crucial in looking at how foreign relations and trade and that kind of thing happens is to realize that countries are not people and they don't act like people. Countries don't have friends. They have interests, and interests change. And so they might be allied for a period of time or trade partners for a period of time. But when conditions change, they will not hesitate to change the conditions, try to make things more favorable for themselves. And there's a lot of complicated stuff going on at that level that we really never see behind the curtain of. We don't have to see all the logistics wheels of turning of how our world works. So I'm only saying all of this to kind of caution against a simplistic view of international relations under a coercive paradigm, because it's very, very, very easy to understand and crucial to understand in interpersonal relationships. But foreign affairs become a whole different level where the same rules don't really apply. Let me put it that way.
I mean, obviously, if we start delving into dictatorships, then that's a whole different ballgame. Then yes, coercive control does start to play a part. But I would agree with you, in standard international relations, not so much.
Yeah, it's a different thing. I mean, again, you could have a strategy to isolate, manipulate, and control a country. On the foreign affairs playing field, a country could initiate a strategy like that. But I think it would be pretty obvious to the rest of the world what was really going on, and if they really were doing something like that. And that's why I kind of go, there's other terms to describe what countries do to each other that might be more accurate than coercive control.
Also, in that, using the trade negotiations as the example here, if one country threatens to put trade barriers up and say to the other country, all your imports are subject to 100% tax now, the other country is just going to do the same thing back. So you just end up with a standstill rather than one country holding the balance. You end up with a trade war.
Yeah, I'll tell you, probably an example of a country that is actually trying to exert some level of coercive control over another country right now would be the Russian-Ukrainian situation. That would be about
absolutely.
as close as I would ever want to say that looks something like Putin trying to coerce that country. But again, you can't isolate a country. Ukraine is now a NATO candidate. You know what I mean? Like, you can't really do it the same way you can do it with a person. Different model, right?
And also Ukraine's a member of the UN, so you've got the United Nations as well, and
exactly
they're also in line for ascension to the EU in the future. So very hard to isolate them completely.
Exactly. And obviously he has not succeeded in any way in isolating Ukraine. So,
you bringing up Russia and Putin, when I was talking about, when you're talking about dictators, coercive control certainly comes into it. It was Putin I was thinking of.
Well, of course. And this is a different conversation, by the way, from is that leader coercing his own people?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's a whole different conversation. And there, for example, we can immediately point to North Korea. Mm-hmm. Right. That's North Korea is a pretty simple situation, comparatively speaking, to say China, Russia, India, United States. These are very, very complicated systems of management and leadership, and a lot of checks and balances. None of that exists in North Korea. North Korea is Kim says, country jumps, period. Mm-hmm. So that's a very culty situation there.
Absolutely. Well, that was the last of the questions. So great. Now we've gone over the basics and gone a bit of a tangent because we've gone off on into international relations as well.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Absolutely, it was a good question. Yeah. That's why I brought it up. I want to firstly thank you for your time. Not just now, but in the other interviews you and I have done on the channel. I have to say you've probably been one of the strongest supporters since I kicked this channel off, and I want to thank you for that personally. And I do feel that there's a lot more we can talk about when it comes to all of this. So we will, let's get Christmas out the way and the New Year out the way, and then we'll arrange to go a bit deeper into some of this and really start to bring it all out. But yes, thank you very much for joining me tonight. And if I don't speak to you before, have a great Christmas. Same goes to everybody who's watching tonight, and all those who do watch on replay. Please leave a like. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. There is going to be a lot of content coming next year. I did check the stats the other day, and 64% of the people that are watching this channel are not subscribed. Please subscribe, because if we can get to monetization, other than the day-to-day running costs of the channel, all proceeds from the channel are going to the Aftermath Foundation to help people who are in Scientology escape. This is cool. I'm not doing this channel to become a millionaire. I want to help people who are already in cults and need that support to get out. And that's why I'm doing this. So thank you all for joining us tonight. I also, because I have been keeping an eye on what's happening with Mike, because I know he has put a few videos out. I do want to, while we're here, send all the best to Mike and hope that he does find healing and peace, because he really doesn't look a well man, unfortunately.
Holding out for a miracle.
Absolutely. So if you do pray, please pray for Mike and pray for healing. Let's just enjoy life, but let's all do what we can to break those chains and try and bring an end to the cults that are out there. Thank you all for joining us.
Bye-bye.